Thanks. So hello from snowy Montreal in Canada. You may know me from my work in public participation GIS, but I've increasingly been looking at public participation in artificial intelligence. I have a project right now called AI for the Rest of Us, and I also host a monthly conference call on AI in Canadian municipalities, in which cities and communities discuss the challenges of implementing and deploying and addressing stakeholder needs when they use AI. You might also be interested to know that I contribute to 2 AI risk assessment tools, and we actually used a map in one. So we're looking for case studies of where in the world is AI and its impacts. I should let you know that that map used to be called AI for Evil, and now they wanted to be a little bit more generic. Okay, so why are we concerned about ethics in GeoAI? I'm going to ask the question, what is GeoAI anyway? Here is a map from CNET investigative reporting, where police had access to a heat map that showed the concentration of ring doorbell cameras in the neighborhood. And what CNET found was that when they zoomed in, they could actually identify the location of people who owned these doorbell cameras. This is denied by Ring, but CNET was able to actually use geocoding to find out where all of these locations were. The CNET article was also worried about the ability of police to share the videos of these Ring cameras without the knowledge of the users, the owners of the doorbell cameras, and the doorbell camera owners, even if they were aware that the local police had them, the owners wouldn't have control over who also might use them. For example, ICE in the United States. What my concern is that these private doorbell cameras fill in the gaps in location-based surveillance. In other words, this is the last mile. So you have public CCTVs, and then you fill in the gaps with these cameras. Now, when people talk about calls for AI ethics, they usually are referring to facial recognition technology and its discriminatory impacts. And this is predominantly based on the training data that's used to classify human beings and the prevalence of that social media contributed data to emphasize white faces and not other colored faces. But it also reflects the way we've developed algorithms to privilege optimization to certain color palettes. And the reason that I chose this particular image is that we use tessellations, essentially Voronoi diagrams, and distance measures to identify people, and also as indications of what's considered beautiful. It's also interesting that major companies have said no to furthering the use and the implementation of facial recognition technology. Another concern is that your cell phone identifies you, and it can identify you through movement patterns. So it's not merely location-based identification, but it's path identification. And this is an example in the US from 2 companies that used information that they readily got from telecoms to identify where spring breakers moved after they were on Fort Lauderdale's beach. So the caution is, well, what they're promoting is that, hey, this is great because we can understand the spread of COVID, but the caution is that it's not nearly as anonymous as these companies thought it was, because your cell phone is in your pocket and your path and locations can identify who you are. Another challenge is that we don't necessarily know how these things work. A lot of GeoAI ethics, a lot of AI ethics presumes that geographers are active developers. But, you know, very few of us are going to develop our own hidden layers. Very few of us are even going to train our models. We're going to purchase a proprietary system or use an extension of existing software. So how much do they or can they know about the system, its parameterization, which can result in a lot of false positives or negatives, or we can do too much overfitting of the training data, the variables that we're relying on, the performance measures that we're using to understand how good the algorithm worked. We may not know the data set that it was trained on. In other words, its geographic location and the limits of its transferability to other places and other applications. Can we test it with explainable AI algorithms or generative adversarial networks? Probably not. So the temptation, I fear, is for GeoAI users to pull some software off a shelf, a software library, and use the default parameters. So it's very much a black box, and it's more than a black box just because we don't know about its emergent probabilities. There's also an issue of whether or not, or how easily this technology can accommodate the special nature of spatial data. So here's a classic example of max pooling. It's a widely used method to pass features from one layer of a neural network to another. And it's in convolutional neural networks, but it lacks topology. It pools, or it counts the number of sub features to identify or classify an object. And this is a good indication of what the object is, but not necessarily does it maintain the relationship amongst the objects. And there's some work being done now in spatial hierarchies to reinsert a topology. But do we even know whether it respects the demands of geometry and topology of our data? Another challenge is that the use of AI can reflect a profound lack of imagination. So here's Brian Nord, an African-American astrophysicist and a machine learning expert. And being one of the few African-American astrophysicists, he started to realize the discriminatory potential of machine learning. But he also notes the way it constrains our imagination and intuition. So he argues that the promise and peril of AI are highly related. In the case of AI, the promise is the ability to describe data that humans don't yet know about, or how to describe with our quote unquote intuitive models, but perilously the data sets used to train them incorporate our own biases. So when it comes to AI recognizing galaxies, we're risking biased measurements of the universe, right? So algorithms are extrapolating based on how we construct the world, or in his case, the universe. So with that, to even begin to construct GeoAI ethic, we have to start thinking about how we bound this definitionally. So So what ethics are we talking about? What GeoAI are we talking about? Or what ethic are we talking about? So here's an example from a Medium article on point convolutional neural networks. And to me, what's interesting about this, over and above, it's pretty good, is that the title of the article is Replacing 50,000 Man-Hours with Artificial Intelligence. And as we know, there are huge implications on the workforce of these technologies. In some ways, this is reminiscent of the whole computer-aided drafting and design replacing draftspeople. And it's possibly time that we start thinking or incorporating these critical issues into whether or not we choose to deploy these technologies. So we need to ask questions like, first of all, what GeoAI are we talking about? A lot of ethics refers to AIML, but really what people are talking about is deep learning. And they tend to be talking about classification algorithms, not necessarily say reinforcement learning. They tend to talk about work on imagery and not text, or not reinforcement in terms of rules. There's also an issue of at what stage should we be talking about a GeoAI ethic? Should we be talking about it at the procurement stage or at the deployment stage? Unfortunately, a lot of the conversation is at the very end. It's like, oh, rats, this is going to affect someone. What are we going to do about that? Or do we talk about prosaic AI, operational AI? No, most of the conversation is about automated decision-making, or ADM, but perhaps we should be talking more broadly about even machine learning algorithms that stitch photos together. So what's the ethics in GeoAI is another issue that we have to think about. So is GeoAI the same as AI ethics? And probably a lot of GeoAI ethics wouldn't be that different. You might be surprised that AI ethics tends not to center on some of the issues we heard early on in this panel. It tends to center on what's called fact, fairness, accountability, and transparency, where there's a lot of conversation about how one computationally debiases data, how one ensures privacy, how one limits surveillance. But also there is consideration of the ways in which these technologies can exploit low-paid labor in distant countries. Because why? Because a lot of these classification algorithms require massive amounts of big data, and that big data to be used as training data has to be human annotated usually. What are you going to do to pay them? Approximately, people are being paid 5 cents US per judgment. So I talked about job loss as well, but these are part of a broader conversation that moves ethics and GeoAI ethics beyond, say, best practices. But let's take a look at the question of best practices. You know, what is that? Is that you bear some, is it how much data should be used as training data versus how much should be set aside for input data? Or is it ethics as responsibility? In other words, you bear some responsibility for the algorithm you created, or the training data set that you compiled, or even the input data that you feature engineered. So it might be useful for us to think about the limits of conceiving of AI ethics and GeoAI ethics as merely about best practices of data usage. If nothing else, best practices in data usage could center the conversation on the intent of the maker rather than the harm that is caused. So I did my best job to make sure that it was good. I can't be responsible for what happened next. And that may be, we may need to push that argument a little bit. Often when we're talking about ethics, we're talking about ethics as morals anyway. If you look at the conversation from philosophers, they're horrified in the way that we talk about ethics, because really ethics is a matter of logical arguments. And we're talking about preventing, say, killer robots. We're not talking about ethics in the same sense that others may be using it. Often when we're talking about ethics in GeoAI, we're talking about ethics for a specific domain or ethics for a specific objective. So is there a generalizability about GeoAI ethics, or is it very narrow to where we have to create specific GeoAI ethics around environmental data? I don't need to spend much time on this because the other panelists have gone over a great deal about the inherent problems in the bias in data, small or big. This is an interesting example where Facebook is trying to use AI to better identify roads from OpenStreetMap, and there's a whole other conversation we could have about the ethics of companies coming in and trying to automate and replace human beings in these larger VGI, volunteer geographic information communities. So we've covered this a lot in the previous conversations, that there's an inherent bias in any spatial data, and getting rid of it is super hard. And certainly Amazon, in its human resources example, in which it found that even after it removed gender in its analysis of training, in its use of training data to train its HR algorithm, it's still biased, the resumes that got through, because there are very subtle ways in which women and men are acculturated to use language in their resumes. So getting rid of it is super hard. Getting rid of spatial data that shows bias is very hard, because spatial data is incredibly important to current AI, whether the companies call it GeoAI or not. And spatial data easily identifies people, and easily identifies and can easily have discriminatory impact. And there is this huge side conversation about, do we want to disrupt the agility of companies to innovate, and any debiasing, rigorous debiasing methods that would essentially remove a lot of spatial data or render it so coarse a resolution that they wouldn't find value in it, kind of a problem. I don't need to talk too much about the ways in which spatial data are impact the outcomes that we can achieve from this. It's quite interesting the way that a lot of software engineers totally don't understand the impact of just sort of aggregating central tendencies at multiple scales. You see this particularly in predictive policing, where they just sort of lump everything together as though a centroid is the same as a heterogeneous distribution of actual incidents. We know that location is an excellent surrogate for personal information. So if you get rid of location, then a lot of these modern algorithms might collapse because of its impact or import to the outcomes. And lastly, is location considered private? Is it personal, or is it considered to, and therefore protected, or is it considered to be public data? So is there an accountability regime to protect people's idea of what they can preserve about themselves and not release, not share with the public? So I will conclude with this slide as a provocation for what a geospatial AI ethic might look like, that reiterates a lot of the points I made previously, and leave it up for questions.
Great, thank you, Renee, for a wonderful presentation. We do have, looks like a question in the Q&A from Francine, who says, does cognitive computing propose similar ethical challenges? Does it fall under the umbrella of AI, or is it a separate field entirely?
That's a hard question to answer. I guess the closest I would come is that AI ethics is intertwined with behavioral analysis. To the extent that the goal of AI is to know what you want and to be able to monetize that, that would touch on cognitive computing. I don't know if that's an acceptable answer to the questioner.
Great, and then I think just some comments about the difference between GeoAI and regular AI have been coming in through the chat from Jiang Yi, who says, to make GeoAI ethics stands, it must be larger than geospatial, geo/spatial/geospatial ethics plus AI ethics. So I think basically, if it's not different, then we're probably a little bit, ahead of ourselves in trying to figure out what it is.
I still think we can make the spatial a special argument.
We can always make the spatial a special argument. That's a great point.